In the summer of 1973, a young man named Earl Mitchell walked into a county office in rural Tennessee and paid exactly $1 for 80 acres of land. The clerk looked at him, looked down at the paper, and looked back up again. He asked Earl if he understood what he was signing. Earl said yes. He folded that deed, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and walked back out into the sun. Nobody laughed to his face, but they laughed. 50 years later, that land was worth $1.8 million. And last spring, a black SUV pulled up the gravel driveway of Earl's farm. A man named Stephen Cole stepped out, straightened his tie, and walked toward the porch holding a briefcase and a thick stack of legal documents. Earl was 74 years old. He had worked that land his entire adult life. And now, for the first time, someone was telling him it didn't belong to him. To understand why this land meant everything to Earl Mitchell, you have to go back to who Earl was before he ever signed that deed. Earl grew up in a small town called Clarkfield, Tennessee. His father worked at a lumber mill 6 days a week and still struggled to keep the lights on. His mother took in sewing to make ends meet. They didn't own the house they lived in. They didn't own the yard their children played in. And that meant it could all disappear overnight. In 1968, Earl was drafted into the United States Army. He was 19 years old. He spent 2 years in Vietnam, came home quieter than he left. He didn't talk much about what he saw, but he stopped wanting temporary things. What people did notice was that something had shifted in him. The boyish restlessness was gone. In its place was something steadier, something that knew exactly what it wanted. Earl wanted land, something no one could take from him. Not money, not a car, not a house in town. Something permanent, something that couldn't be taken away by a landlord or a bank or a bad season. His father had rented his whole life and died with nothing to pass on. Earl had made a quiet promise to himself somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia that his life would be different. He came back to Tennessee in 1971 with $200 in savings, a second-hand truck, and that promise still burning in his chest. He picked up work wherever he could find it. Fencing, hauling, harvest work on other men's farms. He saved every dollar he didn't spend on food. And he kept his eyes open for land. Then, in the spring of 1973, he heard about it from a neighbor. An old farmer named Hector Bullard was dying. He had no children, no living relatives, and a piece of land he had worked for 40 years that he didn't want falling into the hands of a developer. Hector had one condition for whoever took that land. They had to live on it, and they had to work it, and they had to pay him $1, so it was a real transaction, and not charity. Earl Mitchell showed up at Hector Bullard's door the next morning with a single dollar bill and a handshake. Hector looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and said, "Son, don't let them take it from you." The paperwork was simple. 1 page, witnessed by 2 men from the county, a surveyor named Bill Tanner and a notary named Gerald Hopp. Earl signed his name in blue ink. Hector Bullard signed with a shaking hand. And just like that, 80 acres of Tennessee land changed hands for a single dollar bill. But here is what most people never understood about that deal. It was completely legal. Every line, every clause. Hector Bullard had owned that land outright since 1931. No mortgage, no lien, no bank involved. It was his to sell for whatever price he chose. And he chose $1. Because he wasn't selling the land, he was passing it on. Earl took that deed home and read it 3 times at the kitchen table. Then he folded it carefully, slipped it into a manila envelope, and put it in the bottom drawer of his dresser. He didn't frame it. He didn't show it around town. He just went to bed that night knowing that for the first time in his life, something was his. The land itself was rough, overgrown in places, rocky in others. There was an old fence line that had collapsed on the eastern edge, and the soil near the creek had not been turned in years. Some men would have looked at it and seen a problem. Earl Mitchell looked at it and saw a beginning. He spent the first summer clearing brush by hand. He repaired the fence line post by post. He dug out the creek bed where it had silted over and let the water run clean again. Neighbors who drove past slowed down to watch him work. A few stopped and offered help. Most just shook their heads and kept driving. But by the end of that first year, the land looked different. It looked like someone cared about it. And that was the thing about Earl. He didn't just own that land. He tended it. Every single day. The years passed the way they do on a working farm. Slowly, and then, all at once. Earl married Margaret in 1975. She was a school teacher from 2 towns over, practical and patient, the kind of woman who could read a situation without being told what was happening. She took one look at that land, one look at Earl, and decided both were worth her time. They built a small addition onto the old farmhouse that first winter. Nothing fancy, just enough room for what they hoped was coming. Their son Daniel was born in 1977. Their daughter Carol came 2 years after. The children grew up knowing every corner of those 80 acres the way city kids know their neighborhood streets. They knew which section of fence Earl had repaired the year Daniel broke his arm falling off it. They knew where the best blackberries grew along the creek. They knew not to cut through the north field during planting season without asking first. The farm grew slowly. Earl added cattle in the early 80s. A small hay operation followed. There were good years, and there were years that tested everything they had. A drought in 1988 cost them most of the summer crop. A flood in 1993 took out the lower fence line completely, and Earl rebuilt it alone over 3 weeks in the October cold. Margaret used to say that the land gave back exactly what you put into it. Earl believed that. He never stopped putting into it. By the time Daniel and Carol left for college, the farm had become something real. Not just land, but a working operation with a reputation in the county. People knew Earl Mitchell. They knew his cattle were healthy, and his word was good. When he said something was done right, it was done right. And the land itself kept changing. The county grew. Roads expanded. A new subdivision went up 3 miles to the east in the late 90s, and then another one closer in 2004. Property values in the area began to climb in ways that nobody had predicted back in 1973. What had once been considered edge-of-nowhere farmland was now sitting in the path of development pressure that grew a little stronger every year. Earl noticed. He wasn't a complicated man, but he wasn't a foolish one either. He had the land appraised quietly in 2015. The number came back at just over $900,000. He folded that paper the same way he had folded the original deed 42 years earlier, put it in the same drawer, and went back to work. He wasn't selling, not for any number. This was the land Hector Bullard had trusted him with. This was where his children had grown up. This was where Margaret had planted her garden every spring for 30 years. Some things are not for sale. Earl Mitchell knew that better than most. But not everyone saw it that way. It started with a letter. Earl found it in the mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March. Plain white envelope, no return address, just a name printed in the upper left corner. Hargrove Regional Bank. He opened it, standing right there at the end of the driveway, the way he always opened mail. He read it once, then he read it again. The letter said that Hargrove Regional Bank held a claim on 80 acres of land in Clarkfield County, Tennessee. It cited a loan document from 1969, a loan taken out by one Hector Bullard using the land as collateral. The letter said the loan had never been fully satisfied, and it said that under the terms of that original agreement, the land had never been Hector Bullard's to sell. Earl stood at the end of that driveway for a long time. The morning was cold and quiet. A hawk circled somewhere over the north field. He could hear Margaret moving around inside the house, the sound of the kitchen radio playing softly through the window. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back inside without saying a word. He didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. He pulled out the original deed and read through every line, looking for something he might have missed 50 years ago. He found nothing. The deed was clean. The signatures were real. The witnesses were real. Everything he had signed in that county office in 1973 had been legitimate. And yet, that letter sat on the kitchen table like something that refused to go away. 2 weeks later, the black SUV appeared. Stephen Cole introduced himself as a representative of Hargrove Regional Bank. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they have already decided the outcome of a conversation. He handed Earl a second document, thicker than the first, and explained calmly that the bank had recently conducted a review of legacy loan accounts and had identified the Bullard property as an unresolved asset. He used words like outstanding obligation and legal recovery and rightful claim. Earl listened to all of it without interrupting. When Stephen Cole finished talking, Earl looked at him for a moment and said, "I've been working this land for 50 years. I have a deed. I have witnesses, and I'm not going anywhere." Stephen Cole nodded, said the bank understood his position and that they would be in touch through proper legal channels. He got back in the black SUV. He drove away. And Earl stood on that gravel driveway watching the dust settle, feeling something he hadn't felt since Vietnam. The particular weight of knowing that a fight was coming, whether you wanted it or not. Margaret came out onto the porch. She looked at Earl. She looked at the cloud of dust where the SUV had been. She said, "How bad is it?" Earl said, "I don't know yet." She nodded once and went back inside to put the kettle on. After 30 years of marriage, she knew what that meant. It meant Earl was going to need help. Earl called his son Daniel that same evening. Daniel was a contractor in Nashville, practical like his mother, not given to panic. He listened to everything Earl told him without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "Dad, you need a lawyer. Not a general one, a property lawyer, someone who knows land law." The next morning, Earl drove 40 minutes to the county seat and walked into the office of a man named Tom Briggs. Tom was 61 years old, had practiced property law in Tennessee for 35 years, and had the kind of organized mind that liked nothing more than a document with a problem in it. Earl laid everything on his desk: the original deed, the letter from the bank, the second document Stephen Cole had left behind. Tom put on his reading glasses and didn't say a word for 20 minutes. Then he looked up and said, "Earl, this is not a simple case, but it is not a hopeless one either." What Tom Briggs found over the following 2 weeks was this. Yes, Hector Bullard had taken out a loan in 1969 using the land as collateral. But that loan had been with a different institution entirely. a small savings bank called Clarkfield Savings and Trust that had closed its doors in 1971 and been absorbed through a series of mergers and acquisitions over the decades. Hargrove Regional Bank was claiming to be the successor institution that had inherited that original loan obligation. But the paper trail was thin, very thin. Tom filed a formal response, challenging the bank's claim. He requested the complete chain of documentation connecting Hargrove Regional Bank to the original 1969 Clarkfield Savings and Trust loan. He requested proof that the loan had not been settled before Hector Bullard's death. He requested the original collateral agreement in full, every single document back to the beginning. The bank's lawyers responded quickly, which told Tom something. They sent over a thick package of records. Tom went through every page, and on page 47 of that package, buried between two transfer agreements from 1984, he found something that changed everything. A receipt, dated October 14th, 1971, signed by a loan officer at Clarkfield Savings and Trust, acknowledging payment in full of the Bullard account. The loan had been paid off 2 years before Earl ever signed that deed. 2 years before Hector Bullard sold him the land. The land had been free and clear the entire time. Tom Briggs called Earl that evening. He said, "Earl, I found it." Earl didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "So it was always mine." Tom said, "It was always yours." The question now was what the bank knew, and when they knew it. Because that receipt had been in their own files, it had been sitting in their own records the entire time they were sending letters and dispatching men in black SUVs to pressure a 74-year-old farmer into giving up land that had been legally his for half a century. Tom Briggs filed the receipt with the court on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Hargrove Regional Bank had withdrawn their claim entirely. No hearing, no trial, no drawn-out legal battle in front of a judge, just a single phone call from the bank's legal team to Tom's office, and then a one-page letter that arrived 2 days later formally acknowledging that the land known as the Bullard property, 80 acres in Clarkfield County, Tennessee, was the sole and undisputed property of Earl Mitchell. Earl read that letter at the same kitchen table where the bank's first letter had sat 3 months earlier. Margaret was standing at the counter. Daniel had driven up from Nashville. Carol had flown in from Portland the night before, not knowing exactly what was happening, but knowing her father needed her there. The house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when something important is finally over. Earl folded the letter, slowly, the same way he had folded the original deed 50 years ago, the same way he folded every document that had ever mattered to him. He set it down on the table. He looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Dad, you want to go walk the land?" Earl looked at his son for a moment, then pushed back his chair and stood up. He put on his coat. He put on his boots, and the two of them walked out the back door into the cold afternoon and crossed the field together, without saying a word. Carol watched them from the kitchen window. Margaret stood beside her. The two men walked slowly across the frozen ground, past the old fence line Earl had rebuilt alone in the October cold 30 years ago, past the creek that Earl had cleared by hand in that very first summer, all the way out to the far edge of the north field where the land met the tree line, and the sky opened up wide and pale above them. They stood there for a while, just the two of them, father and son, on land that had always been theirs. There is something that gets lost in stories like this when people tell them too fast. The part that isn't about money or documents or legal victories. The part that is just about a man who wanted something real in a world full of temporary things and worked for 50 years to keep it. Earl Mitchell paid $1 for 80 acres of land in 1973. He cleared it by hand. He built a fence post by post. He raised a family on it, weathered droughts and floods on it, grew old on it. When someone came and told him it wasn't his, he didn't panic, and he didn't give in. He just went and found the truth, because the truth, like the land itself, had been there the whole time. For 50 years, Earl worked that land, and in the end, the truth stayed right where it belonged. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who held on to what mattered. We'll see you in the next one. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. Next time, we're covering a widow in rural Kentucky who refused to sell her land, no matter what they offered her. You won't want to miss it. We'll see you there.